William Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
I'd like to welcome you to the last of this year's Samuel and Althea Stroum Lectures in Jewish Studies on the invention. Oh, invitation would not be bad. The invention of Hebrew prose. Now you're thoroughly confused. Now, by this time, one thing that I'm sure you're not confused about is who Professor Robert Alter is, and so I don't think you need any further introduction. More important, you have seen evidence of his splendid background in modern and biblical Hebrew language and literature, and in the methods of linguistic and literary analysis. You have also been witness to the fineness of his perception and his capacity to open both the obscure and the seemingly incidental text. I would like only to bring to your attention one quality that no single series of lectures could demonstrate, and that is the impressive range of his work, his constant effort over the years to move always into new areas of study. Such is not the hallmark of all the people in this profession, whose habit is too often to keep going down into the same mine, sometimes long after it is empty. Professor Alter has written major genre studies of the picaresque and self-reflexive fictional traditions. He has ventured into the thickets of critical biography, a critical genre in itself. He has examined modern Hebrew literature, biblical prose and poetry, and now the beginnings of Hebrew fiction. In the course of these beginnings, these shifts forward and backward in time, and from country to country, he has had to master several languages and national literatures, not to mention a variety of critical approaches. In recent years, he has confronted the structuralist and post-structuralist revolutions in criticism, necessitating the mastery of still another language. Although allegedly written in French and English, there is considerable doubt. During the question period of Professor Alter's second lecture, someone raised a question on Russian fiction. And during his reply, Professor Alter noted that he did not know Russian, but that he hoped to take it up before too long. I thought this a strikingly characteristic response. Still another major literature that needs to be studied in its own language. I was reminded, and you may find this next allusion a bit remote, but I think this is what introductions are for. I was reminded of a well-known story about Franz Rosenzweig, perhaps the most significant Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. Rosenzweig stressed the importance of Jewish ritual in coping with the problem of belief. When asked whether he himself observed a particular commandment of the 613 required, he would never say no. If he did not observe it, he would instead say, not yet. In part, he was adhering to an orthodox notion that while none of us is likely to practice all 613 mitzvot, we must not reject any conclusively. But he was also keeping open the lines of his possibilities. What I have done is not necessarily what I will do, and what I know need not be the limit of what I will know. And so, if one were to ask Robert Alter, do you know Russian? Do you know Chinese? Do you know the history of flower arrangement? I suspect that if the answer is not already yes, and nothing would surprise me, it might well be not yet. The title of tonight's lecture is Realism Without Vernacular. Professor Alter.
Oh, okay. While I was genuinely gratified, actually, by Professor Cartagena's eloquent introduction, I couldn't help thinking of something irreverent, which was shortly after I arrived at Berkeley, an emeritus professor in one of the departments I'm connected with, whom everybody despised, died. And this happened in the summer when most people were away. And the person who was arranging the funeral called me and asked me if I would deliver a eulogy on behalf of the department. And I said, well, I said, why don't you go to Professor X or Professor Y? So they were all in Europe. So I figured, well, you do these sort of things for the family and not for the person, so I'll think of something to say. And as everyone couldn't stand this man, in addition to which he was notorious as being a shoddy scholar who pretended to know everything. So I got up, and the first thing I said was, well, I wasn't really privileged to know Professor Z very long. And then the second thing I said was, in this day and age of over-specialization in the academy, now, I want to explain one thing that only I know about, which is that I've succeeded in performing an act of sympathetic magic here in Berkeley, because once we get on to the particular work of fiction that I want to use as my example, you'll see that we are going to be in the Riviera, temperature maybe 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's in honor of that we've had the weather we've had today. My last prefatory remark is that for those of you who've been utterly fatigued by my close readings of these texts, I can promise 12 to 15 minutes of general historical narrative at the beginning of this evening's presentation. The fin de siècle fashioners of a new Hebrew prose, whom we have been considering, with the single exception of Yosef Chaim Brenner, had no part in the Zionist enterprise. They were not necessarily antipathetic to the early stirrings of Zionism in their time, but they themselves were drawn to a different cultural horizon. It is quite possible that there was, nevertheless, a powerful, if unintended, connection between their peculiar literary project and the political project of Zionism that would gather momentum through the next 3 or 4 decades. The Israeli critic Dov Sadan long ago proposed that there was a kind of imaginative logic, these are my words, not his, which produced a compelling movement from literature to politics. After writers had succeeded in creating an as-if reality in Hebrew, the conditions of consciousness had been established in their readers for seeking to build an actual Hebrew reality, with all the requisite social institutions and political apparatus in the real geography of this world. Let me just underline that the emergence of prose fiction in Hebrew well antedates political Zionism. Remember the date I gave you in the first lecture, the first Hebrew novel came out in 1853, and as you know, Herzl is toward the end of the century. My guess is that Sadan's suggestion contains a kernel of truth neglected in the conventional accounts of the rise of Zionism. It is, however, a truth of hindsight. For what Mendele and his forerunners in the Hebrew Enlightenment had in mind, and after Mendele, Gnessin, Berdichevsky, and most of their contemporaries, as the writers I was talking about Thursday night, was the creation on Central and Eastern European soil of an authentically European Hebrew fiction. The proponents of the Hebrew literary revival, of course, also had similar aspirations for poetry and discursive prose. But fiction, in my view anyway, provides the crucial test case for their anomalous enterprise, because it involves not just expression and argument, but the constitution in language of a whole world that could encompass the consciousness of the characters, their speech, their appearance and gestures and dress, and the social institutions and natural settings they inhabit. To create a body of modern fiction in Hebrew was a way of remaining profoundly Jewish in cultural identity, an identity continuous in language and allusion with a 3,000-year tradition of Hebrew literature, and at the same time thoroughly at home in the realm of cosmopolitan European culture, exploiting the resources of what had been, since the 18th century, the characteristically modern European genre, the novel. For the handful of intellectuals spun off from the traditional Jewish milieu, that is, as I said the other day, from the yeshivas, who forged the new Hebrew fiction, it was, in a sense, a calling card that gave them entry into the great polyglot salon of European culture, as if to say, we belong here as equals, and we're proud to display our original address. The strong perception of Hebrew as the living national language of the Jews, even as it remained an unspoken tongue, was a necessary but not sufficient condition for this literary movement. What also was required was a cultural setting that could make feasible the very idea of a literary enclave using a language other than that of the majority national group. The extraordinary flowering of Hebrew literature in medieval Spain was made possible in part by the fact that the Jews of that time and place had before their eyes in the Arabs a model of a people who spoke one language, vernacular Arabic, and wrote another, the classical Arabic of the Quran. And so they were spurred to competitive imitation using the classical Hebrew of the Bible, of course, instead of the classical Arabic of the Quran. It seems likely that the transplanting of this Iberian Hebrew revival to Renaissance Italy was facilitated because a roughly similar linguistic situation obtained there. The country, this Renaissance Italy, was fragmented by local dialects, in many instances not even mutually comprehensible, while after Dante, the usual medium of literary expression was Tuscan, that is, from Dante's region, which was in a way an artificial language, at least from the viewpoint of the other regions. Modern Hebrew literature, though its ideological beginnings are in monolingual 18th century Prussia, comes to fruition chiefly in the multinational, multilingual Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. In the townlets from which many of the Hebrew writers came, as well as in the various urban centers to which they gravitated, it would not be unusual for them to hear spoken by different national ethnic groups 2 or 3 or even 4 languages: Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, German, Ruthenian, and of course Yiddish. Against this background, it would have been far less bizarre for them than it may seem to us to create a body of fiction in which the cafes and parks and reading rooms of Odessa, Vilna, Warsaw, and Vienna are populated by figures that talk and think in Hebrew. When some of the devotees of the Hebrew revival migrated westward, beginning early in this century and in increasing numbers between the 2 wars, they of course carried their linguistic reflexes with them to places like Berlin, Paris, London, and New York. But as anyone can attest who has had the opportunity to know the émigré Hebraists in New York as recently as the 1950s, a couple of them were among my teachers, these writers, displaced from their multilingual setting, were doomed to declaim sonorous Hebrew cadences in a historical vacuum. It is in an essentially monolingual country, which offered relatively open access to people of talent, those with literary gifts in the younger generation, as occurred spectacularly with the children of the East European Jewish immigration to the United States, would of course be drawn to the dominant language. The older Hebraists then were left brandishing a literary torch with no one to whom they could pass it on. By the first decade of the 20th century, partly for the reasons specified by Dov Sadan, that is, trying to make an as-if Hebrew reality into a real one. More and more the younger Hebrew writers were making their way to Palestine, attracted by the promise of national renaissance of the second Aliyah, or immigration, which was in fact really the first wave of Zionist immigration that involved more than a tiny handful of pioneers. In those years, Hebrew literary works begin to be published in the land of Israel, and the first Hebrew literary journals there make their appearance. Paradigmatic is the story of a 19-year-old Hebrew fiction writer named Shmuel Yosef Chachkas, who in 1907 arrived in Palestine by way of Vienna from his hometown in Galicia at the eastern end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the double intention of making his literary career and realizing himself as a Zionist. After 6 years, the young man, who had changed his name from Chachkas to Agnon and had already achieved a rather spectacular early success, felt that the arid cultural atmosphere in the Palestine of those years was too limiting, and he went to Germany, apparently with a vague intention, in fact to be impressively realized, of extending his self-cultivation as an autodidact, as a self-instructed man. Caught in Germany by the outbreak of the First World War, Agnon remained there until 1924, a total of 11 years, becoming in these years a major figure in Hebrew fiction and a writer with an economically secure future, almost unique if you write in Hebrew, having acquired as patron Zalman Shokin, the German department store magnate turned publisher. By the time he returned to Palestine and settled permanently in Jerusalem, the center of Hebrew literature had shifted decisively to the land of Israel, and the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language, which Agnon himself would always pronounce with a marked Galician Yiddish accent, this revival was in full swing. What complemented this pull toward the ancestral land was the destruction of the European cultural base of Hebrew literature in the years 1914 through 1918 and thereafter. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up after the war, in part replaced by a group of more nearly monolingual national entities that could not provide so congenial a context for the flourishing of a literature in Hebrew. More decisively, the overthrow of the Tsarist regime by the Soviet Revolution rang the death knell on Hebrew literature in its greatest European center. In the first few years after the revolution, there were some ambiguous grounds for hoping that the Bolshevik regime might look with favor on Hebrew as a legitimate member of the family of ethnic linguistic traditions allowed to continue their development under the Soviet umbrella. Habima, the first Hebrew repertory theater, was established in 1917 and allowed, believe it or not, with Stalin's approval, to continue through the mid-1920s, and then it migrated to Palestine. 2 Hebrew literary miscellanies, that is sort of slim, one-time appearance volumes, were published, featuring poems and stories that rhapsodically praised the revolution as the dawning of a new age of freedom for all mankind. But very quickly, Hebrew was declared a counter-revolutionary clerical language. Hebrew publication was banned and instruction of the language prohibited, and of course this goes on till today. One by one, the Hebrew writers made their way across the border to the west. In a couple of notable instances, aided by the intervention of Maxim Gorky, who was acquainted with some of the Hebrew poets and novelists and had influence with Lenin. For a time during the 1920s, it seemed as though Hebrew literature might be able to establish new European bases, especially in Berlin and perhaps Paris. In Germany, 2 fine Hebrew publishing houses were active. Stiebel, transplanted from Moscow by way of Warsaw, and Schocken, the latter also having a German language operation, which in the quality of their literary titles and the elegance of their typography and bookbinding would not be surpassed, I think, or even equaled by any of their Israeli successors. HaTekufah, one of the most impressive of the European Hebrew literary journals, was issued from Berlin, having migrated westward from Moscow, where it was founded in 1917. In all likelihood, none of this would have sustained itself in the West with its open invitation to cultural assimilation for more than a generation. But as European history took a catastrophic turn of unprecedented proportions, 1933 put an abrupt end to Hebrew literature in Germany, and 1939 to Hebrew literature in the rest of Europe. One of the most fascinating and finally exemplary figures in Hebrew literature during these years of gathering darkness is the poet and novelist David Fogel, that's F-O-G-E-L. He was born in a small town in Podolia in the southwestern Ukraine in 1891, which places him almost a generation after Gnesin and makes him nearly coeval with Agnon, who was born in 1888. At the age of 19, in other words, still well before the First World War, Fogel sets out on what will prove to be an incessant career of peregrinations. He sojourns briefly in Vilna, then Odessa, Lemberg, and beginning in 1912 in Vienna, as if on an inadvertent pilgrimage of the major way stations of Hebrew literature in Europe. Overtaken in Vienna by the First World War, he is arrested as an alien subject and spends almost 2.5 years in prison. Life outside of prison walls is scarcely less bleak. Fogel is constantly at the edge of poverty, supporting himself when hardly knows how, and he lives in relative isolation. His somber modernist poetry, collected in 1923 under the title Before the Dark Gate, generally meets with incomprehension or hostile criticism. His first marriage in 1919 lasts only 4 years, and both he and his wife suffer from consumption. In the mid-20s, Fogel moves from Vienna to Paris. Late in 1929, he travels to Palestine with the apparent intention of settling there. But this quintessential European feels himself an outsider to the new Zionist reality in the Middle East. And after a few months, he returns to Europe, to another year of restless movement, then in 1931, back to Paris, where he remarries and has a daughter. From the late 20s onward, he concentrates on fiction, writing a novella, Sanitarium, in 1927, publishing with a house in Palestine a fascinating novel of psychological aberration, Married Life, 1929-30, and then in 1932 another novella, Facing the Sea. He is caught in France by the Nazi occupation. The last that is known of him is an indication in an official document that he was transported to Germany in February 1944 into the kingdom of death. The best one can say of this melancholy tale is that it has a posthumous happy ending. Until the early 1960s, Fogel was usually thought of as a peripheral figure in Hebrew literature. In 1966, the prominent Israeli poet Dan Pagis edited and introduced the complete poetry of David Fogel, and many younger Hebrew critics and poets now began to view Fogel with his understatement, his ellipses and dissonances, his imagistic and expressionistic qualities as a major precursor of post-1948 poetic modernism in Hebrew. His novella Facing the Sea, originally published only in periodical form, was rediscovered and reissued in 1974 as an elegant little volume by the literarily prestigious Siman Kriya publishers. And now the same house, really in just the last few months, has just brought out a new edition of the novel Married Life, with significant revisions based on the original manuscript, buried by Fogel in a garden in Paris before his last arrest, and eventually conveyed to Israel. Apparently he left instructions with a Gentile friend about where the manuscript was buried. Facing the Sea, that is the 1932 novella, provides an apt epilogue to the story of the invention of Hebrew prose on European ground. It was composed, as I've noted, in 1932 at the last moment before the curtain of apocalypse began to come down on European civilization. Its setting and subject are preeminently European. Adolf Barth, a Viennese engineer with a job in Paris, comes with his lovely young mistress Gina, also Viennese, for a summer's vacation to a little seaside town on the Riviera a few miles from Nice. Under the baking sun, in the semi-nakedness of bathing costumes, I quote, nakedness banished the distance between them, leveled them to the fundamental equality of the hour of birth and of death. Multiple entanglements ensue. Barthes has a single, passionately fierce sexual encounter with a French woman named Marcel. Gina attracts but wards off a German named Kraft, whom she meets on an expedition to Nice. Then she succumbs, letting her will go slack and her body take over, to a certain Cicci, a swarthy, powerful, sexually insistent Italian workman. After which she undergoes an extreme reflex of revulsion, as much from her own body, which she feels has asserted a kind of alien independence, as from her seducer. The experience, with its manifestation of a primal erotic urge that is essentially impersonal, as indifferent to emotional attachments as to propriety, taints her relationship with Barthes. In the end, she insists on leaving him, and the last image of the novella is her receding view from the window of her northbound train of Barthes, standing on the platform, quote, like a lifeless beam, his head leaning slightly to one side, holding his hat with an upraised hand without waving it. These are the very last words of the story. I've outlined the plot of Facing the Sea, in part to suggest how thoroughly European and how thoroughly characteristic of the period between the two wars this novella is. The vacation setting involves the coming together of figures from different points on the European map, and despite the Hebrew medium, there is no indication that any of the characters is a Jew. Unlike another branch of Hebrew literature, clearly the bigger branch, which constantly revolves around a problematic of Jewish national and historical concerns, the themes of this story are as universal as eros and civilization. The disruptive sexual magnetism of the dark, southern, working-class male felt by the northern European woman is a subject familiar to readers of English literature from the stories of D.H. Lawrence. The use of the holiday situation on the edge of the elemental sea as an occasion for the dissolution of customary barriers, the release of dark urges. There's a hint of animalistic violence in the sexual acts. The nightlife of the vacationers, complete with naked dancing, is orgiastic, and Cicci ends up knifing someone in an argument. All this is reminiscent of Thomas Mann, of some of Nabokov's 30s stories, and other fiction of this period. I'm not sure if enough is known about Vogel's actual reading to propose influences, but the affinities in theme and setting with the whole current of 20th century European fiction are striking. What concerns us centrally is the degree to which Vogel succeeded in realizing these themes and this story in a language that, unlike Mann's German, Lawrence's English, Nabokov's Russian, was not a spoken language. And now we finally get back to our topic of prose. By 1932, of course, it had in fact become a spoken language in Palestine. But as far as Vogel was concerned, it was not a vernacular. He was certainly in touch through reading with new coinages and other kinds of innovation of the revived Hebrew of the land of Israel. And even without his brief stay there, he certainly would have been capable of sustaining a conversation in Hebrew. Nevertheless, his Hebrew came to him through literary sources, and it has the earmarks of a literary language without a vernacular base. This characteristic is transparently evident in his dialogue, which sounds stilted and artificial, and is a compound of phrases from classical texts, bearing no visible relation to Hebrew as it was spoken even in 1932. Given the inadvertent quaintness of the language of the dialogues, the great surprise about the prose of Vogel's narrator is that it is so unarchaic, so supple and precise. Here and there, to be sure, there are certain odd terms for particular garments or objects that have not become part of modern Hebrew usage. It's a bit like reading a perfectly contemporary story by, say, E.M. Forster or Catherine Mansfield, in which you occasionally run into a Middle English word for robe or slip or balcony. But these are no more than minor moments of strangeness in a mimetic prose that is more fluent, even more beautifully natural than anything that would be reproduced in the next generation, the first native one, of Hebrew fiction in Israel after 1948. The potential for artistic maturity in the European tradition of Hebrew writing may be suggested by the fact that Vogel's stylistic achievement would be matched or surpassed only in the second and third generation of native Israeli fiction. In the work of writers like Amalia Kahana Karmon, the later A.B. Yehoshua, the late Yaakov Shabtai, and most recently, David Grossman. In tracing the transition from Mendele to Gnessen and other anti-Nusach writers in the early years of the century, I placed considerable stress on the new central role accorded to representing states of consciousness. And here, let me remind you, for those of you who weren't here on Thursday, of just one technical term I'm going to be using: narrated monologue, which is monologue not reported in the first person, but in the third person. It's the words that the character speaks to himself, but given to us through the narrator. In other words, if a character would say, "I could just wring his neck," the narrator would say, "She could have just wrung his neck." And it's still monologue, but it's narrated. Okay, I'll be using that term as I go on. There are little bits of narrated monologue and even quoted interior monologue in Vogel, and one suspects his prose would not have the suppleness it does without the example of Gnessen. But on the whole, he is much less interested in the direct representation of consciousness in its own idiom than in the narratorial mediation of consciousness, which in turn is integrated with the rendering of scene and action in a language belonging to the narrator, which at once has lyric suggestiveness and painterly precision. For Gnessen, absorbed, that is the subject of my last lecture, absorbed in mental process, the proper subject of fiction is the inner world of feeling, cogitation, and recollection, for which, as we saw, the external world is no more than pretext or stimulus. Vogel, on the other hand, is constantly drawn by the allure of the outward reality accessible to sensory perception. As a result, he repeatedly strives for a coherent visual definition of scene, seeking to appropriate the sensory world through his Hebrew with the same poised authority that one might find in the French of Gide and Proust, the German of Musil and Broch, and of course, living in Vienna and then Paris, Hermann Broch and Musil, M-U-S-I-L, living in Vienna, and the first two are both Viennese writers, and the second two, obviously, Parisian writers. In his prose, as in his poetry, he is always wary of the habits of effusion that have marred much modern Hebrew writing. And so these acts of mimetic appropriation are, for the most part, carried out with a few carefully controlled strokes. Here, for example, is Vogel's representation of a midsummer noon in the little Riviera town. Gina and Bart have just returned from swimming and are preparing to go into the local restaurant for lunch. This is extract 1. The sun now stood directly overhead. In the main street, made up of a single row of houses facing the sea, as though split lengthwise, the lights shimmered like molten orange liquid. The solitary passers-by crushed their own shadow beneath their feet. I've called the narrator's language painterly, but one must add that the painterly quality has a decidedly post-impressionist cast, exhibiting in the novella as a whole a preference for a few bold primary colors: orange, blue, yellow, and an occasional red. Figurative language, though it plays an important role in conveying the nuances of sensory detail as well as the mood of the scene is compact to the point of terseness, in keeping with the scaled-down proportions of the whole description. The play of lights is like molten orange liquid, and the pedestrians in this relentless noonday brilliance appear to be crushing or trampling on their own foreshortened shadows. In translation, all this may look like deft, if unexceptional writing. Reading it in the original, one is struck by the extraordinary precision of the diction. The words are all available to the writer from the classical Hebrew sources, both biblical and rabbinic. Vogel is not especially inclined to new coinages. But after 2 generations of post-Haskalah prose, which had shown how this old wine could be poured into new bottles of various shapes and sizes, Vogel is able to make the classical vocabulary work with the nicety of a living literary language, sure of the fine shadings of meaning and the range of associations of different terms. The ultimate lexical origins of the first sentence, "the sun now stood directly overhead," are biblical, but it does not feel particularly biblical even in the Hebrew, in contrast to an inset of allusion or mock epic in the Nusach style, but rather comes across as a telling way of reporting a very simple piece of temporal information. In the original, the sun does not stand, but in good Hebraic idiom, encamps, chanta'al. And what I have rendered as overhead is literally on the head, with the word for head, not the standard rosh, but kod, a term that quite shorn of the many figurative senses attached to rosh, that is, you can be the head of a community, that's also rosh. This kod better conveys the sheer physicality of this part of the body, its very skullness. Thus, through the most minimal verbal gesture, Vogel's narrator beautifully communicates a sense of the sun at its fierce zenith, pounding down on the exposed human head, encamped over or on it. The more conspicuously poetic move of representing the shimmer of reflected lights as molten orange liquid is a more intricate instance of impressive lexical precision in the Hebrew. The verb for shimmer, rachash, has the basic meaning of minute oscillating movement and a semantic range that could include stirring, seething, vibrating, even buzzing. It's exactly the right choice for the hazy, trembling movement of summer sunlight over surfaces. Of half a dozen or more Hebrew words for burning hot, the one selected, lohet, is perfect for the descriptive task at hand because it suggests incandescence and brilliance, and is also cognate with a term that means passion. Finally, the rather ordinary lights of my English version are in the original not the standard orot, but the distinctly literary nugohot in the Bible used only in poetry, and as such the term has a kind of aestheticizing effect in context. It's not a simple variation of light that the narrator's eye detects in the noonday scene, but a play of luminosities, a spectrum of effulgences in orange, hot, fluid incandescence. What I've been describing in these few lines, and what is pervasive in the style of Facing the Sea, is a sense communicated by the language of the writers having unlocked the expressive resources of classical Hebrew to fulfill the aims of a thoroughly European fictional realism. As a matter of historical linguistics, it's noteworthy that by 1932, a consensus of literary usage involving nuanced distinctions among terms had crystallized, as I talked earlier in my series about the instability of many terms in early modern Hebrew. It is true that in the realm of material existence, in the vocabulary for foods and implements and apparel, there were still elements of instability and vagueness, which would be settled only as full agreement on meanings emerged from the one place where Hebrew was being used as the spoken and written language of everyday life. But Vogel's prose is striking testimony to this early consensus of literary usage. His ability to work assuredly within the consensus explains to a large extent why much of his language continues to seem perfectly contemporary. Let me offer just one more example, this time with briefer commentary, of Vogel's descriptive precision, a water scene to match the land scene we've just looked at. This is the second extract. The water beat secretly against the beach. Nearby, a rowboat crept past, filled with naked bodies, noise, and laughter. Stefano's brood were in it, Marcel and her Parisian girlfriend too. Arms and legs dangled over the sides of the boat and splashed through the water. From amongst the voices peered the heavy orange stillness. The scene is realized not from the angle of perception of any of the characters, but from the overviewing standpoint of the narrator, who is content, however, to suggest the objects of description fragmentarily, in rhetorical terms, by synecdoche, that is, the part for the whole. Naked bodies, a tangle of protruding limbs, a profusion of voices and laughter. Again, the Hebrew moves with the assurance of lexical authority. Nitchabtu, a passive reflexive form, nicely appropriate for the beating of or the slapping of the waves against the shore. Meshur bavot for the arms and legs, a word that means to stick out and or to dangle. Nishtach shechu for the splashing of the limbs in the water, another rabbinic passive reflexive verb form, using a root that is associated with laundering and rapid to and fro movement, and that in context produces an onomatopoeic effect, that is, the word sounds a little bit like the thing it refers to. Capping this descriptive fidelity, Vogel suggests the mood, the inscape of the scene, by shifting to a more explicitly poetic strategy, synesthesia, that is the mixing of two different sensory realms, here sound and sight, orange stillness, and synesthesia and metaphor, as the stillness, heavy and orange, is made to peer or peep out, hetzitza, from the midst of the thicket of sound. The paradox of silence, a palpable, colored silence, hiding at the heart of noise and laughter, is characteristic of Vogel's rendering of this whole holiday world, in which the revelry of the vacationers is played out within a force field of impersonal powers disturbing in their implacability. This troubling vision of the fragility, the quite literal superficiality of civilized reality is central to our general concerns, because the creation of a new Hebrew prose involved much more than the shaping of a linguistic instrument to answer technical needs of representation, such as states of consciousness, physical appearance, mechanical procedures, material objects. Writing novels in Hebrew, as we had occasion to observe earlier, was intertwined with the adoption of a European mindset in regard to such fundamental aspects of the conceptual world as the indication of causation, relation, association, the discrimination of time, the perception of sensory details and their importance, the spatial definition of action. But beyond such general categories, modern Hebrew writers, perhaps more radically in prose fiction than in poetry, were embarked what was in effect a transvaluation of Jewish values, whether they happened to be Nietzscheans like Berdichevsky, again I mentioned him on Thursday, or non-ideological like Vogel, or even seemingly traditionalists like Agnon. In most instances, including the one we're looking at, this transvaluation was not the consequence of a willed effort to stand the world of classical Judaism on its head, but rather the inevitable reflection of a process of acculturation in depth, that is, learning in depth to be part of the surrounding culture. The Hebrew writers, nurtured on the imaginative and philosophic literature of modern Europe, very often came to see the world in a perspective sharply different from that of their forebears, and were impelled to make their language match that new vision. I don't mean to suggest that the classical Jewish sources themselves exhibit anything dimly resembling unanimity in their implied sense of what the world is like. In fact, the historical spectrum that runs from the Bible to rabbinic literature to medieval philosophy and the Kabbalah is altogether baffling in its variety. There are nevertheless certain notions, certain modes of conceptualization which remain outside the range of this varied tradition that would exert powerful appeal on the modern Hebrew imagination. Two such notions of central relevance to facing the sea are the precarious status of civilization over against a more enduring world of elemental forces, and the related idea of a split between mind and body, in which body is not the yetzer, or instinctual urge of rabbinic literature that is an energizer of the soul, but rather a weirdly autonomous entity, vaguely threatening to consciousness. How does Vogel go about conveying this new, clearly disorienting sense of reality? Technically, the stance of the narrator enjoying free access to the consciousness of the characters from a viewpoint that remains outside or perhaps above consciousness, with the freedom to depict it analytically, is indispensable for the imaginative definition of the writer's distinctive vision. Let me offer two examples of this careful refraction of the inner life of the characters through the narrator's language. A relatively simple one from early in the novella, and a more complex summarizing instance that occurs just before the end. When Gina goes off by herself on a day's outing to Nice, she's described as exuding a kind of sensual ripeness in her strawberry red silk dress and her big earrings, stirring fantasies, we're not quite sure whether they're the narrators or those of the men who are in the story who are watching her, of exotic lands, quote, where people go around naked and their heart's impulse is wild and mighty, rooted in primeval nature, in God, end quote. In this ambience of generalized arousal, in the scorching midsummer heat, she sits down at a sidewalk cafe, and this is our next quotation, our next excerpt. Leaning back, she took pleasure in this idle sitting at the edge of the noisy boulevard. She looked at the people, scrutinized the faces of the women and what they were wearing, and the day burned hotter and hotter before her eyes. The pulse of life pounded fiercely, within her as outside her. The sensation of her own body was awake in her, and she felt affection for it, for this mysterious, seething body, as for a creature distinct from her. This moment nicely illustrates how Vogel is able to move from the experiential realism pioneered in Hebrew by Gnessen to the narrative representation of what amounts to a new ontology, a new sense of the constitution of reality. The depiction of a pretty young woman alone in a Riviera resort town, checking out the looks and clothes of the women going by, has an obvious realistic plausibility. The pivotal point in the passage, I think, is the little clause, and the day burned hotter and hotter before her eyes, which in the Hebrew is more compact and more graceful, if in one respect a bit odd. That is, it reads, V'hayom lahat le'eneha v'halach. The tense used is a progressive form derived from rabbinic Hebrew, pa'al v'halach, which is used to indicate a steady intensification of the action specified by the verb. The utilization of the form here is perfectly continuous with the interest in subjectively experienced process. Remember, I put a big emphasis on process last Thursday night, that we observed in Gnessen. The slight oddness is that the Hebrew le'eneha, before her eyes, is inserted against the grain of the idiom, in between the verb burned hot or glowed and the intensifying auxiliary halach. This small syntactic maneuver has the effect of stressing the subjectivity of perception. The day is no doubt hot, but it is through Gina's eyes as she sits in the cafe that the shimmering waves of mounting heat are seen. The next sentence, however, firmly ties what is going on within her to what is going on in the world around her. Its grammatical and thematic subject, the pulse of life, dofek hachayim, is no doubt a Europeanism. That is, I don't think you say pulse of life in classic Hebrew. It's just the sort of phrase that Berdichevsky, with his revisionist vitalism, might have imported into Hebrew, though I can't actually document that in this case. The notion of an intersubjective and perhaps cosmic pulse of life is not, as far as I know, one that occurs in the various currents of traditional Jewish thought. But in Vogel's novella, the whole plot ultimately turns on that idea. Once it's been introduced here, pounding both within the protagonist and outside her, the narrator proceeds with a complex definition of the nature of her consciousness at this moment, as she feels affection for her body, which she seems strangely disjunct from her, not a natural extension of her sense of self. Vogel depends crucially on the modern coinage tehusha, sensation, from the verb hush, to feel, because this sort of discrimination needs a vocabulary that will give it a power of nice abstraction. That is, what I'm arguing all along is that in order to think in a certain way, you have to have the words to think that way. Before you had this nice abstraction, tehusha, meaning something like sensation, you couldn't make this kind of analysis of how the mind works. The concluding adjective badul, distinct or separate, is a rabbinic term that is given a specialized modern meaning and thus complements sensation in making possible the analytic precision of the observation. Otherwise, what happens stylistically is that Vogel pushes indigenous Hebrew idioms to convey unfamiliar perceptions and relations. Symptomatically, Gina feels affection for her body, hagata elav ahava, a phrase based on the rabbinic haga elav chiba, though probably a shade stronger, as ahava, in distinction to chiba, is more like love than affection. The idiom sounds perfectly natural in Hebrew, but the context is surprising, even disorienting. For in the midrashic texts where the usage originates, nobody has ever said to feel affection for his or her own body. It's a small instance of how a strange new world is constituted in the words of an age-old Hebrew. Toward the end of the novella, after Gina has announced to Barthes her intention to leave him, at least for the time being, he steps out onto the balcony of their hotel room, looking back on her as she packs her suitcase. In this case, I guess I didn't want those two cases colliding that way. In this instance, as the narrator moves into the consciousness of the character, he employs more elaborately metaphorical means to represent it. And now we go to our next extract. He arose and walked over to the balcony door, then stood there facing into the room. Silently, he followed her movements. From outside, the muted sound of piano playing filtered in, no doubt from the nearby pension. And this playing, too, was now unfamiliar, not a part of the chain of shining days and nights colored with sun and moon, but the opposite, alien, infuriating, like a foreign element that didn't belong here. Here, there was no place now for a spirit of gentle and delicate nocturnal melancholy that is absorbed by the soul unwittingly and suffuses it like the distant, untroubling fragrance of violets. Now, in this space, fragments were rolling about of something that had shattered irrevocably, neither through his fault nor Gina's, that had shattered through fate's cruelty, and a feeling of orphanhood, gnawed and pierced to the point of tears. The two short sentences at the beginning of the paragraph simply report Barthes' physical actions, of course, walking toward the balcony. The third sentence, which registers the sound of piano playing from the neighboring pension, shifts to the character's point of view, the transition signaled by the adverbial indication of supposition, no doubt, or you might translate it as one could assume. In the original, it's the Aramaic mistama. Instead of the certainty of the omniscient narrator, that is, the narrator would be sure it's coming from the pension. The character only has to assume it. But what follows is not really narrated monologue, despite a certain contamination, which we'll consider momentarily, of the narrator's language by the unspoken language of the character. Vogel, in keeping with his general purpose of intimating experiential process through finely wrought artifice, in a way combining the aims of the Nusach writers interested in artifice and the anti-Nusach ones who are interested in process, he lends Barth a coherence of metaphoric summary of experience that is surely more the narrators than the characters. The weeks of vacation splendor that had collapsed into a private nightmare are a chain, or literally a necklace, machrozet, of shining days and nights colored with sun and moon. I say that the exquisite control of that language, I think, is the narrators rather than the characters. And the broken bond between Barth and Gina is a hopeless heap of fragments rolling about the room. Embedded in this poetic and essentially narratorial rendering of consciousness are bits of citation. I'll explain citation of what in a moment. That is, fate's cruelty at the end, and more elaborately, the spirit of gentle and delicate nocturnal melancholy. In the Hebrew, ruach shel tuga aravit kalila ba'anuga, that Barth feels has vanished from the space he shares with Gina. This last phrase, this spirit of gentle melancholy, reflects a certain banal sentimental lyricism in the character, an engineer by training, but presumably possessing a degree of Central European high middle-brow literary cultivation. Stylistically, the language here is drawn from the kind of Hebrew lyric poetry in vogue in the late Haskalah through the 1890s and beyond, roughly equivalent in its aestheticizing effusions to pre-Raphaelite verse in English. Vogel's use of the citation illustrates how modern Hebrew had managed to become a multi-layered literary language well before it was revived as a vernacular. Stylistic precedents give the writer not only a language to represent consciousness, but also to represent, with a suggestion of irony, false consciousness, diluted by the cliches of popular literature. And this is particularly ingenious with presumably the language that Barth speaks and reads as German. So it's kind of German high kitsch poetry that he's nurtured his own illusions on. And Vogel finds a way of discovering Hebrew equivalents for this in the modern Hebrew literary tradition. But the irony here is rich because, like Flaubert's in relation to Emma's romantic raptures in Madame Bovary, it exhibits a certain nostalgic sympathy with the character's poetic illusions. Thus, Vogel weaves together with the cliches about nocturnal melancholy his own lyric coinage for the soul's being suffused by sadness, quote, like the distant, untroubling fragrance of violets, giving a suggestion of genuine delicacy to that poetry-induced condition of lover's mooniness whose loss Barth mourns. This seamless prose, in sum, enables the writer at once to define the complex meanings of the character's experience and to indicate a duality of attitudes toward it. A final extended illustration will amplify the sense we have developed of the novelistic ripeness of Vogel's language.